Brigid heard the war horns echoing across the Irish countryside and prayed that the Viking raiders would simply take what they wanted and leave her village in peace. What she didn't know was that Irish captives were branded with hot iron to mark them as property, forced to watch their children sold to different masters, and required to serve their Viking owners in every conceivable way, including as human sacrifices during religious ceremonies, because to the Norsemen, Irish slaves weren't people to be eventually freed. They were livestock to be used until death. Welcome to Historical Stories for Sleeping. Before we begin this heartbreaking story of Brigid, whose peaceful life in medieval Ireland was shattered when she discovered that Viking slavery meant the complete destruction of family, identity, and hope, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and if you believe that no human being should ever be treated as property. Hit that subscribe button and share this story to honor those who suffered under history's cruelest systems of bondage. The mist rose from the River Shannon like the breath of sleeping spirits on that fateful morning in 843 CE, when Brigid ny Sile woke before dawn to tend the fire in her family stone cottage. At 19, she was considered one of the most beautiful women in her village of Clonmacnoise, with hair the color of autumn leaves and eyes as green as the Irish hills that surrounded their peaceful settlement. She had been married to Cian for 2 years, and their infant son Aidan slept peacefully in a wooden cradle that Cian had carved with intricate Celtic knots. Life in Clonmacnoise was simple but fulfilling. The village sat beside one of Ireland's most important monasteries, where monks preserved ancient knowledge and created illuminated manuscripts that were treasured throughout Christendom. Brigid helped her mother-in-law tend their small garden, wove cloth from wool they spun themselves, and found deep joy in watching her baby son discover the world with wide, wondering eyes. "The ships are coming," old Padraig called out as he stumbled into the village center, his voice cracked with terror and exhaustion. He had been fishing in the early morning when he spotted them, longships with carved dragon heads cutting through the mist like harbingers of doom. Dragon ships on the river. Vikings. They'll be here before the sun clears the trees. The word Vikings struck the village like a physical blow. Everyone had heard the stories from other settlements, tales of sudden raids, villages burned to ash, people carried away in chains never to be seen again. But Clonmacnoise had always felt safe, protected by its holy monastery and its distance from the coast. The idea that Norse raiders would sail this far inland seemed impossible. Brigid clutched baby Aidan to her chest as panic erupted around her. Women screamed for their children. Men grabbed whatever weapons they could find, and the monastery bells began ringing desperately in warning. But there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide that would be safe from raiders who had sailed hundreds of miles to reach them. "Take the baby and get to the monastery," Cian told her, his face pale but determined as he picked up his farming scythe, the closest thing to a weapon he possessed. "The stone walls might protect you until they leave." But even as he spoke, they could hear the terrible sound approaching, the rhythmic splash of many oars, the creak of wooden ships, and something else that made Brigid's blood freeze. Singing. The Vikings were singing as they rowed toward their village, their voices carrying across the water like a funeral dirge for the lives they were about to destroy. The attack came with the sunrise, swift and merciless as a summer storm. The dragon ships beached along the riverbank, and disgorged warriors who seemed like creatures from a nightmare tall, bearded men covered in mail and leather, carrying axes and swords that gleamed in the early light. They moved with practiced efficiency, surrounding the village before most of the inhabitants had time to flee. Brigid ran toward the monastery with Aidan crying in her arms, but she had made it only halfway when a massive hand grabbed her shoulder and spun her around. The Viking who held her was young, perhaps only a few years older than herself, with pale blue eyes and braided blonde hair. He said something in his harsh northern language, then reached for her baby. "No," Brigid screamed, holding Aiden tighter. "Please, he's just a baby." The Viking's response was to strike her across the face with the back of his hand, a blow that sent her sprawling to the ground. As she lay dazed, he picked up the crying infant and examined him with the same calculating gaze a farmer might use to evaluate livestock. Apparently satisfied with what he saw, he tucked Aiden under one arm and hauled Brigid to her feet with the other. Around them, the village was being systematically destroyed. Houses that had sheltered families for generations went up in flames. The monastery, despite its stone walls and holy purpose, was being ransacked for anything of value. Brigid could see other villagers being rounded up, the young and strong separated from the old and weak in a selection process whose purpose was terrifyingly clear. "Kian," she called out, searching desperately for her husband among the chaos. She spotted him near the burning remains of their cottage, fighting 3 Vikings with nothing but his scythe. He was brave and determined, but he was no warrior. As she watched in horror, one of the raiders buried an axe in his chest, and Kian fell to the ground where he lay motionless in a spreading pool of blood. The scream that tore from Brigid's throat was barely human. She lunged toward her husband's body, but the Viking holding her pulled her back with casual strength. When she continued to struggle, he handed baby Aiden to another raider and drew a small knife from his belt. The blade was sharp and well-maintained, and he held it to Brigid's throat while speaking to her in a calm, conversational tone that needed no translation. "Be still, or die." As the sun climbed higher, the full horror of the raid became clear. Of the nearly 200 people who had lived in and around Clonmacnoise, perhaps 60 were still alive. The old, the sick, and those who had fought too hard were dead. The survivors, mostly women, children, and young men, stood in chains beside the river, watching their world burn, while Viking warriors loaded their ships with everything of value they could carry. Brigid found herself chained to a line of other captives, her baby somewhere among the raiders, where she could hear him crying, but could not reach him. The iron shackles around her wrists were heavy and already chafing against her skin. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the agony of knowing that Kian was dead, that her life as she had known it was over, and that whatever lay ahead would be worse than anything she could imagine. Yes, the dragon ships prepared to depart, carrying their human cargo toward an uncertain fate in distant lands. Brigid looked back one last time at the burning ruins of Clonmacnoise, the home where she had been born, the village where she had fallen in love, the life where she had been happy. All of it was disappearing into smoke and ash. She was no longer Brigid Nisile, beloved wife and mother. She was now property, marked for a life of slavery in a foreign land where her son would grow up as someone else's possession and where her own identity would be slowly, systematically destroyed until nothing remained of the woman she had once been. The journey into hell was just beginning. The Viking longship Raven's wings stretched 60 feet from stem to stern, but with 43 Irish captives chained in its belly alongside the crew's plunder, there was barely room to breathe. Brigid found herself crammed between Sile, a girl of perhaps 14, who had been taken from a neighboring village, and Muirish, an elderly monk whose monastery had been raided the day before theirs. The chains that bound them allowed little movement, and the wooden planks beneath them were already slick with vomit and worse. "Where are they taking us?" Sile whispered, her voice barely audible over the creak of oars and the harsh commands of the Viking crew above. Muirish answered in Latin, then caught himself and switched to Irish. "North, child, to the lands of ice and snow, where we will serve masters who worship gods of war and death." His voice carried the weight of knowledge gained from other monks who had survived similar raids. "I have heard tell of Irish slaves in markets from Dublin to Denmark. We are cargo now, to be sold to whoever offers the best price." The journey across the Irish Sea was a nightmare of seasickness, hunger, and despair. The captives were given one meal a day, a thin gruel that tasted of fish oil and was often spoiled before it reached their bowls. Water was even more precious, rationed in tiny portions that left them constantly thirsty. The waste bucket was emptied only when the smell became unbearable to the crew above, leaving the captives to endure conditions that would have been unthinkable for livestock. Brigid's greatest agony was not knowing what had happened to baby Aidan. She could sometimes hear infants crying from other parts of the ship, but the Vikings kept the children separated from their parents, a deliberate cruelty designed to break the spirits of those who might otherwise resist. When she begged the guards in broken Norse she had picked up from traders, asking only to hold her son for a moment, they laughed and made gestures that needed no translation. The baby belonged to them now, not to her. "They're breaking us before we even reach land," Muirish observed quietly during their second night at sea. "Separating families, denying us basic dignity, making us dependent on their mercy for every drop of water. By the time we arrive wherever we're going, we'll be so grateful just to be alive that we'll accept whatever they do to us." The monk's words proved prophetic. As the days passed, Brigid watched her fellow captives transform from defiant prisoners to broken souls who had learned to be grateful for scraps. Pride was a luxury they could no longer afford. Dignity became secondary to survival. Hope was replaced by the simple animal instinct to endure another day. Out on the fourth day, one of the captives died, an older woman named Brigid, who had been taken from the same monastery as Muirish. Her body was simply thrown overboard without ceremony, as if she had never been a person at all. The Vikings showed no more emotion at her death than they would have at discarding spoiled cargo. "Will they do the same to us if we become sick?" Sile asked, her young face pale with terror. "Worse," Muirish replied grimly. "They'll keep us alive as long as we have value, but the moment we become more trouble than we're worth." He didn't need to finish the thought. The ship made landfall after 6 days at sea, arriving at a coastal settlement that Brigid later learned was in the Kingdom of Dublin, itself under Viking control. But this was not their final destination. They were marched to a slave market where Irish captives were bought and sold like cattle, their human worth reduced to calculations of strength, youth, and potential labor. It was here that Brigid experienced the first of many brandings that would mark her new status. A Viking slave trader pressed a red-hot iron against her shoulder, burning a mark that would forever identify her as property. The pain was excruciating, but she forced herself not to scream, some stubborn part of her Irish pride refusing to give her captors the satisfaction of seeing her completely broken. "This one's strong," she heard the trader say in Norse to a potential buyer. "Good for field work or breeding. The brand marks her as processed through Dublin. Guarantees she's not stolen local stock." The casual discussion of her future, as if she were a piece of livestock, was almost more devastating than the physical pain of the branding. She was being evaluated not as Brigid, wife and mother, but as a resource to be exploited until she was used up and discarded. The buyer who eventually claimed her was a man named Eric Bloodaxe, though she would not learn his name until much later. He was older than most of the warriors she had seen, with gray streaking his blond beard and scars that spoke of decades of warfare. His examination of her was thorough and impersonal, checking her teeth like those of a horse, testing the strength of her arms and back, asking the trader questions about her health and breeding potential. "I'll take this one and the young girl beside her," Eric announced after completing his inspection. "How much for the pair?" The negotiation that followed was conducted in Norse, but Brigid understood enough to know that she and Sile were being sold together, perhaps because the trader thought they were related, or perhaps simply because Eric wanted two females of different ages for different purposes. The price agreed upon was 20 silver pieces for both of them, a sum that seemed impossibly small for 2 human lives. As they were loaded onto Eric's smaller ship for the journey to his homeland, Brigid caught one last glimpse of baby Aiden. He was being carried by a Viking woman who seemed to be cooing over him affectionately, and for a moment Brigid felt a surge of hope. Perhaps her son would be raised with kindness, even if he could never know his true heritage. But then she saw Eric's expression as he followed her gaze to the baby. There was calculation there, and something else that made her blood run cold. When he spoke to one of his men, pointing toward Aiden, she heard words that she recognized from her limited Norse vocabulary: useful and sacrifice, and when he's older. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her son was not being taken to be raised as a cherished child. He was being preserved for some future purpose that she could barely comprehend, but knew with absolute certainty would be terrible. The Vikings did not see Aiden as a future member of their society. They saw him as raw material for whatever dark purposes their religion demanded. As Eric's ship pulled away from the Dublin coast, carrying her toward an unknown fate in the frozen Northlands, Brigid made a silent vow. Somehow, some way, she would survive whatever lay ahead. She would endure whatever they did to her. And someday, if the gods of her ancestors had any mercy left, she would find a way to save her son from the fate that awaited him in the lands of ice and blood. But first, she would have to learn what it meant to be a slave in a society that viewed her people as less than human. And that education was about to begin. Eric's homestead lay in a fjord so narrow and steep-walled that it felt like sailing into the mouth of a giant stone beast. The wooden longhouse stretched along the shoreline like a sleeping dragon, its peaked roof carved with intricate designs that Brigid would later learn depicted the genealogies of gods and heroes. But what struck her most immediately was the smell, a mixture of smoke, fish, animals, and something else that made her stomach clench with anxiety. "Welcome to your new home, Irish cattle," Eric announced as they were dragged from the ship and up the rocky beach. His command of her language was better than she had expected, suggesting that he had owned Irish slaves before. "You will work here until you die, and your children will work here after you die, and their children after them. This is the way of things, and fighting it will only bring you pain." The interior of the longhouse was a revelation of organized chaos. The central hall stretched nearly 100 feet, lit by fires that burned in stone-lined pits along its length. The smoke rose toward openings in the roof, but much of it lingered, creating a perpetual haze that stung the eyes and throat. Along the walls, raised platforms served as sleeping areas for Eric's extended family. His wives, children, aged parents, and unmarried siblings all lived together in a complex hierarchy that Brigid would need to learn quickly if she hoped to survive. "These are my new Irish workers," Eric announced to the assembled household. "The older one is Brigid. She'll help with the heavy work. The younger is Sile. She'll start in the kitchen and learn household tasks." He paused, studying both women with cold calculation. "Remember, they are property, not guests. Treat them as you would treat valuable livestock, useful, but ultimately expendable." Brigid was assigned a sleeping space in the slaves' quarters, a section of the longhouse near the animals, where the air was thick with the smell of goats, sheep, and pigs. The bed was a pile of straw barely large enough for one person, and it was infested with insects that bit constantly throughout the night. But it was shelter from the harsh northern weather, and she had already learned to be grateful for any mercy, no matter how small. Her first task was to learn the household routine, which began before dawn and continued until well after sunset. As a house slave, Brigid was responsible for milking the goats, feeding the animals, hauling water from the stream, maintaining the fires, and assisting with food preparation. The work was exhausting, but it was the psychological aspects of slavery that proved most devastating. Every aspect of her existence was controlled by others. She could not speak unless spoken to. She could not eat until all the free members of the household had finished their meals. She could not sit or rest without permission. Even basic bodily functions had to be requested, and permission was sometimes denied as a form of casual cruelty that reminded her constantly of her powerless status. The key to managing slaves, she overheard Eric explaining to his teenage son Olaf, is to make them understand that their survival depends entirely on our goodwill. Give them just enough food to work, just enough shelter to survive, just enough hope to prevent despair, but never enough to feel secure. The other members of the household treated Brigid and Sile with the same casual indifference they showed to the livestock. She was fed scraps from the family meals, bones with little meat, bread that was stale or moldy, porridge thin enough to see through. When she became ill from the poor diet and harsh conditions, no medical attention was provided. She was expected to continue working until she either recovered or died. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of her new life was the complete erasure of her identity. Eric refused to use her Irish name, instead calling her Red, in reference to her auburn hair. When she tried to correct him, explaining that her name was Brigid, he had her beaten by one of his sons and made it clear that slaves did not have names, only functions. "You are not Brigid," he told her as she knelt bleeding from the beating. Brigid was a free woman who lived in Ireland. "You are Red, my property, and you will answer to the name I give you, or you will not answer at all." The systematic destruction of her identity extended to every aspect of her former life. She was forbidden to speak Irish in the presence of the family, forced to attempt communication in broken Norse that marked her as foreign and inferior. When she was caught praying in Irish to the Christian God of her childhood, she was beaten again and warned that slaves worshipped their master's gods or no gods at all. "Your Irish God has no power here," Eric informed her. "If he cared about you, he would not have allowed you to be captured. You belong to the Norse gods now, and they value only strength." The isolation was complete and deliberate. Brigid was cut off from everything that had once defined her: her language, her religion, her culture, her name, even her memories of family and homeland. The Vikings understood that controlling a slave's body was not enough. They had to control her mind and spirit as well. As winter approached, Brigid learned about another aspect of Viking slavery that she had not anticipated. Eric's household, like most Norse settlements, operated as a closed economic system where every person had a specific role and value. Slaves were not just workers, they were also breeding stock, expected to produce the next generation of bondservants. "You are young and healthy," Eric observed one evening as he studied Brigid with the same calculating gaze he had used at the slave market. "It's time you started earning your keep in other ways. Gunnar here needs a woman, and you need to start producing children for my household." Gunnar was Eric's nephew, a brutal young man who had already fathered several children with other slave women. The casual way in which Brigid was assigned to him as a breeding partner was perhaps the most dehumanizing moment of her captivity so far. She was not being asked for consent or even consultation. She was simply being informed that her body would now serve another function in the household economy. "Please," she begged Eric, abandoning the Norse words she had been forced to learn and reverting to Irish in her desperation. "I'm still mourning my husband. I can work harder, serve better. But please don't dash." The beating that followed was severe enough to leave her unconscious for several hours. When she woke, she found Sile sitting beside her makeshift bed, tears streaming down the younger girl's face. "They say if you resist again, they'll sell you to the sacrifice priests," Sile whispered. "And they say if I help you resist, they'll do the same to me." Brigid understood the message. In Viking society, slaves who could not be controlled through normal means became religious offerings to gods who supposedly demanded human blood. It was a fate worse than death, a destruction not just of the body, but of any hope for the afterlife, that made suffering meaningful. As she lay in the straw that night, listening to the sounds of the household settling into sleep around her, Brigid faced a choice that defined slavery in its most essential form. She could resist and die meaninglessly, accomplishing nothing except her own destruction. Or she could submit, preserving her life in the hope that someday, somehow, she might find a way to escape, or at least to protect other innocents from the fate that had befallen her. The choice was no choice at all, but making it required abandoning the last vestiges of the woman she had once been and accepting transformation into something else, something that could survive in a world where humanity was a luxury that slaves could not afford. The brand came on the first day of winter, when the fjord had frozen solid and the longhouse was sealed against a brutal cold that could kill a person in minutes. Brigid had been in Eric's household for 4 months, and she had learned to recognize the signs that preceded each new level of degradation. The way Eric's eyes would linger on her during meals, the whispered conversations between family members that stopped when she approached, the arrival of the iron brand in the fire, heating until it glowed white-hot. "Today you receive the permanent mark of this household," Eric announced as his sons held Brigid's arms while she knelt beside the central fire. "No matter where you go, no matter how far you run, this brand will identify you as my property, and the gods will know that your death belongs to me." The iron pressed against her forehead was agony beyond description. The smell of her own burning flesh filled her nostrils as the metal seared through skin to leave a mark that would never heal completely. She had managed not to scream during previous brandings, but this one broke her. The sound that tore from her throat was barely human, a cry of anguish that seemed to echo from the very depths of her soul. "Good," Eric said with satisfaction as he examined his handiwork. "Now everyone will know that you are mine, body and spirit. Even death will not release you from my service." The threat was not idle. Brigid had learned about the Norse practice of sacrificing slaves at their masters' funerals, ensuring that even death provided no escape from bondage. Valuable slaves were expected to follow their owners into the afterlife, where they would continue serving in the halls of the gods. It was a form of slavery that extended beyond the grave, denying even the hope of eventual freedom through death. But the branding was only preparation for what Eric had planned next. As Brigid knelt bleeding and sobbing beside the fire, he gestured for Gunnar to approach. His nephew was already drunk on winter ale, his eyes bright with anticipation for what was about to occur. "The Irish woman is properly marked now," Eric announced to the assembled household. "Tonight she begins her new duties as Gunnar's breeding slave. May the gods grant that she produces strong sons for our clan." What followed was witnessed by the entire household, including children who watched with the casual interest they might show for the mating of livestock. Brigid's resistance was brief and futile. Weakened by months of poor food and harsh treatment, she had no strength to fight against men who had spent their lives preparing for violence. But the physical violation was only part of the horror. The Vikings had designed the ceremony to be as psychologically devastating as possible, complete with ritual elements that transformed rape into religious observance. Prayers were spoken to fertility gods. Runes were carved into wooden tokens that were placed around Brigid's neck. The household chanted in unison, calling upon divine powers to bless the union and ensure that it produced children who would serve the clan faithfully. "This is how we make Irish slaves into Viking property," Eric explained to his son Olaf, who was watching intently as part of his education in household management. "We take their bodies, but more importantly, we take their souls. We make them complicit in their own enslavement by forcing them to bear children who will never know freedom." The morning after brought new humiliations. Brigid was required to thank Eric publicly for allowing her to serve Gunnar, to express gratitude for the honor of potentially bearing children for the clan. When she could not force the words from her throat, she was beaten until she managed to whisper the required phrases of gratitude and submission. "I thank you, Lord, for allowing me to serve your household," she finally managed to say, each word feeling like poison on her tongue. "I am grateful for the honor of bearing children for your clan." The Vikings understood that forced gratitude was more degrading than simple violence. By requiring slaves to express appreciation for their own exploitation, they destroyed the psychological boundaries that allowed people to maintain inner dignity even in the face of physical abuse. As winter deepened and the nights grew longer, Brigid discovered that her ordeal was far from unique. The Longhouse contained several other slave women who had endured similar ceremonies of sexual enslavement. Some had been captured years earlier and had already borne multiple children for their Viking masters. Others were recent acquisitions, still adjusting to the reality of their new existence. "The first year is the hardest," whispered Deirdre, an Irish woman who had been captured 5 years earlier and now served as Eric's primary household manager. "You still remember what it felt like to be free, so every new degradation feels like the end of the world. But after a while, you stop remembering, you stop hoping, and then survival becomes easier." Deirdre had 3 children by different Viking men, all of whom had been raised as members of the clan rather than slaves. She spoke of them with obvious love, but also with a pain that never fully healed. They called her birth mother, but showed her no more affection than they would show any other servant. They had been trained from infancy to view her as property rather than family. "Do you ever think about escape?" Brigid asked during one of their rare private conversations. Deirdre's laugh was bitter. "Where would I go? Even if I could somehow get away from here, even if I could survive the journey south, what then? My children are here. They may not love me, but they're still my blood. Would you abandon your son if you knew he was somewhere in this house?" The question cut deep because Brigid had been wondering the same thing. Rumors suggested that baby Aiden was being raised in Eric's brother's household, just a few miles away. Sometimes she thought she heard infant cries on the wind, though she could never be sure if they belonged to her son or to other children born into slavery. The psychological torture of separation from her child was perhaps worse than any physical abuse. The Vikings understood that maternal love was the strongest force in most women's lives, and they used it as a weapon to ensure compliance. Slaves who knew their children were nearby but unreachable would endure any humiliation rather than risk behavior that might result in being sold away from their offspring. "That's how they keep us," Deirdre explained. "Not with chains or locks, but with love. They scatter our children throughout the clan, close enough that we know they're alive, but far enough that we can't protect them. They make us choose between freedom and motherhood, knowing that no real mother can choose freedom." As the winter progressed, Brigid learned that she was pregnant. The knowledge filled her with complex emotions, joy at the prospect of new life, terror at bringing a child into slavery, and despair at the realization that this pregnancy bound her even more tightly to her captors. Any child she bore would belong to Eric's clan, not to her. It would be raised to view her as a servant rather than a mother. Another future Viking warrior, Eric announced when Deirdre confirmed the pregnancy. The gods smile upon this household. Red has proven her worth as breeding stock. The casual dehumanization of reducing her pregnancy to animal husbandry was devastating, but Brigid had learned not to show emotional responses that might be interpreted as resistance. She nodded submissively and expressed the required gratitude for being allowed to bear a child for the clan, but inside, in the small space of her mind that remained her own, she made a vow. This child would know love, even if that love had to be hidden. Somehow, she would find ways to pass on memories of Ireland, of freedom, of the family that had been destroyed. The Vikings could control her body and her words, but they could not control the stories she would whisper to her baby in the darkness. She would ensure that somewhere in the heart of this child born into slavery, the memory of freedom would survive.